Hello guys. Don't forget to subscribe if you like this story. Let's get started. So, my buddy Tom asked me to grab a beer after work. We were about halfway through our second round when I spotted this guy at the bar. Let's call him Mike. We'd met a handful of times over the years, usually in passing, but we weren't exactly close. He gave a small nod, and after a while, we started chatting about work, family, and other small talk. Then, out of the blue, he asked me if my wife, Lisa, was planning to attend their 15-year high school reunion. Now, Lisa and I have been married for just over 13 years. She's 37, and we have two boys, 11-year-old Sam and 9-year-old Max. Lisa's one of those people who seem ageless. She's got this warmth about her, with a smile that lights up a room, and she still looks incredible with her dark hair that gleams in the sun. We met in college and clicked right away. After graduation, we got married. And aside from taking short breaks when the boys were born, she's always worked. I work from a small home office, which gives me a bit more flexibility, and we settled in Lisa's hometown. My family's spread across different states, so it made sense to stay close to hers. When Mike asked about the reunion, I was a little surprised. Lisa hadn't mentioned anything about it. So, I told him I'd check with her later. He mentioned that it was coming up next Friday at the local convention center, and that Lisa was even on the planning committee. I thanked him for the heads up and headed home. My curiosity piqued. That night, over dinner, I brought up the reunion with Lisa. She looked slightly taken aback, but then casually shrugged and said, "Oh, yeah, I signed up for it a while back. I didn't think you'd be interested." She explained it was supposed to be a low-key event, nothing fancy. There was something in her response that didn't quite sit right with me. I couldn't pinpoint exactly why, but it felt off. Later that night, curiosity got the better of me, and I dug out her old high school yearbooks from a dusty box in the closet. As I flipped through the pages, I came across a few pictures of her with a guy named Dan Walker. In some of them, they looked pretty close, laughing and leaning into each other. I couldn't help but wonder if they'd been more than just friends. The next day, I found myself back at the bar, hoping Mike might be there again. I wanted to know more about Dan Walker. As luck would have it, Mike was right there at the counter, nursing a beer. We got to talking again, and I casually brought up Dan's name, hoping to sound as nonchalant as possible. Mike looked at me with raised eyebrows and said, "Oh, Dan? Yeah, he and Lisa were inseparable back in high school. Everyone thought they'd end up together. He was kind of a big deal around here. Star athlete, class president, that sort of thing." I nodded, pretending it was no big deal, but internally, I was spinning. Mike went on, mentioning that Dan now lived out in Seattle, was married, had kids, and had climbed the ranks at some big tech company. Part of me felt reassured. He had his own life now, a family, and a career. But then again, that just made me wonder why Lisa hadn't mentioned him at all. If he was really just some old high school buddy, why keep it under wraps? When I got home that evening, curiosity got the better of me again. I found myself searching for Dan Walker online. Sure enough, Mike hadn't exaggerated. Dan's social media was exactly what you'd expect for someone who'd made it big. Pictures of him with his family, posts about his work, and the occasional motivational quote. He seemed harmless enough. But then, something caught my eye. His phone number was registered to a Seattle area code. And that's when it hit me. Lisa had a bunch of calls on her phone from a Seattle number. A weird feeling settled in my stomach. I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, Lisa and Dan were more than just old classmates catching up. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop the questions from flooding my mind. Was this something innocent, just a bit of nostalgia rekindled over a few phone calls? Or was there more to it? I had always trusted Lisa, but I started to realize how little I actually knew about her past. I knew I couldn't confront her outright, not without something more concrete. So, I decided to play it cool, but I'd stay vigilant. Maybe I'd check her phone again or casually bring up the reunion one more time, see if anything new came up. One way or another, I was determined to get to the bottom of this. After my conversation with Mike, my suspicions wouldn't let me rest. Lisa hadn't mentioned Dan even once, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on behind my back. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I needed to know the truth. So, I decided to keep a closer eye on her. I did something I never thought I'd do. I put a small tracker in her car, It felt wrong, like I was crossing a line, but my gut was screaming at me to get some answers. I also set up a recorder in the house, hoping it would clear things up. Maybe this was all in my head, and Lisa was just reconnecting with an old friend. But if it was more than that, I had to be prepared. A few days passed without much out of the ordinary. I tried to act as natural as possible, but the tension in our home was nearly palpable. Then, one evening, as I played back the recorder, I froze. I heard Lisa's voice, clear as day, talking to Dan. My stomach dropped as I listened. They were arranging to meet at a hotel. My mind went into overdrive. I couldn't let this happen, not without doing something to intervene. I called Lisa right then and there, trying to keep my voice steady, and told her I'd be picking Dan up from the airport instead. She was caught off guard but agreed without protest. I knew she wouldn't expect this move from me. At the airport, I spotted Dan right away, looking just like he did in those photos online. Sharp, confident, someone who seemed comfortable in his skin. I introduced myself, making it seem casual, and after a bit of small talk, I invited him to stay at our place for the night. If Lisa wanted to see him, she'd have to do it right in front of me. That night, I was on high alert. I tried to keep things light, acting like a friendly host, but every glance, every interaction between Lisa and Dan was like a punch to the gut. They seemed almost too comfortable around each other. At one point, as I went to the kitchen to grab another round of drinks, I glanced back and saw Dan's hand on Lisa's thigh. She quickly brushed it away when she noticed me, but I'd seen enough. I knew I couldn't let this drag on. The next morning, I suggested taking Dan out for a round of golf, just the two of us. He seemed enthusiastic, probably thinking it was a friendly gesture. But I had a different plan. Out on the course, as we walked a fair distance from the clubhouse, I brought it up directly. I told him I knew about his plans with Lisa and that I wasn't going to stand by and let it happen. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I laid it all out and told him in no uncertain terms that he needed to back off. Dan tried to downplay it, saying it was just a catch-up between old friends, but I saw right through him. I didn't want to get physical, but I made sure he understood the consequences if he didn't take me seriously. We were alone, out of earshot of anyone else, and I let him see the side of me that wasn't afraid to protect my family. Eventually, he seemed to get the message. When we got back, I kept my distance and watched him pack up his things. He left quietly, and I was relieved to see the back of him. But now I had to face Lisa. I wasn't sure if she'd be honest with me, but I wasn't going to let her brush this under the rug. That evening, after the kids were in bed, I sat down with Lisa and told her I knew about her conversation with Dan. I played the recording for her, watching her reaction closely. She looked stunned, and a flash of guilt crossed her face as she listened. When it ended, she couldn't even look me in the eyes. She admitted she'd had unresolved feelings for Dan, feelings she thought were long buried but had resurfaced when he reached out. She was visibly shaken as she spoke, apologizing repeatedly. She insisted that she loved me and our family, that she'd never meant for it to go as far as it did. I listened, taking in her words, but part of me was still reeling from the betrayal. I had to make it clear that this was her last chance. If we were going to make it, she needed to cut all ties with Dan, and we'd have to rebuild from the ground up. To my surprise, Lisa agreed without hesitation. She promised to end all contact with Dan and even suggested going to therapy. She said she wanted to be more open with me, to regain my trust. It sounded sincere, but only time would tell if she meant it. The past few months have been rocky, to say the least. Therapy has helped us communicate better, and Lisa has been making an effort to show she's committed to our family. I'm still wary. I can't ignore the doubt that lingers, the part of me that questions every little thing. But I'm hopeful that, in time, we can move forward. It hasn't been easy, but we're trying, and for now, that's all I can ask for. Despite all the challenges we'd faced, things with Lisa finally seemed to be on the mend. She was attending therapy sessions regularly, and every time she came home, she'd tell me about her progress. It was like she was genuinely working to rebuild our trust and reconnect with me in a way we hadn't in years. We started going out on more dates, taking small trips, and, for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe we'd come through the worst of it. But then, just as I was starting to let my guard down, I stumbled on something that set off alarms. One evening, Lisa left her phone out on the counter, and a strange text message flashed on the screen. It was from an unknown number, and the message was short and cryptic. There was no name attached, just a time and place, nothing more. My heart sank. I didn't want to believe it could be anything suspicious, but after everything we'd been through, I couldn't just ignore it. Not wanting to jump to conclusions, I decided to investigate quietly. I used a tracking app to trace the phone number, hoping to get some clarity. The trail led to a payphone located in a nearby town, about 20 minutes from our home. The situation felt too strange to brush off, so I decided to drive there to get a closer look. When I got to the town, I began asking around, doing my best to keep things low-key. It wasn't long before I met a local who recognized the payphone in question. He said he often saw a woman using it late at night, keeping to herself and looking around as if she didn't want to be noticed. He mentioned that she usually appeared tense, as if she were hiding something. Hearing that, I knew I had to find out more, so I started going to the payphone at night myself, hoping I'd catch her there. A few nights passed without any sign of Lisa or anyone else, and I almost thought I was overreacting. But then, on the fourth night, my heart dropped when I saw her. Lisa was standing there, talking on the phone with her back turned to me. She was looking around cautiously, her voice low and tense. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something about her tone that told me she was on edge, and it only fueled my worry. When she hung up and walked away, I followed her at a distance. She didn't head straight home. Instead, she made her way to a small diner just off the main road. I parked my car in the shadows and watched as she walked in and sat down at a booth. Not long after, a man joined her, Dan. My stomach churned as I watched them talk, their expressions heated. I couldn't hear them from where I was sitting, but it was obvious from their body language that it wasn't a friendly catch-up. Whatever they were discussing seemed intense, something she hadn't shared with me. Once their conversation ended, I waited until Dan left before I confronted Lisa. She looked startled to see me there, her face pale, and I could tell she wasn't prepared for this. I asked her directly who Dan was to her now, and why she was meeting him in secret. She hesitated, clearly trying to come up with an explanation, but I wasn't backing down. I needed the truth, no matter how painful it might be. After a tense silence, she finally broke down and confessed. Dan had been reaching out to her for weeks, trying to rekindle their relationship. She admitted that she'd agreed to meet him, hoping to finally put their past behind her. She told me she was torn between her commitment to me and the unresolved feelings she still had for Dan, feelings that had resurfaced the moment he'd gotten back in touch. She'd thought she could handle it on her own without telling me, but it was clear she hadn't been able to let go. Hearing her confession, I felt a wave of betrayal crash over me, stronger than anything I'd felt before. She had promised me transparency, a fresh start, and here she was, hiding things from me again, keeping secrets that only pushed us further apart. It felt like a knife in my chest, and I could barely bring myself to respond. The trust we'd been rebuilding was shattered in an instant, and there was no fixing it this time. I told Lisa that I couldn't keep doing this, that I couldn't trust her anymore, and that we were over. She pleaded with me, telling me that she wanted to fix things and make things right. But in that moment, all I could see were the lies, the secrets, the endless cycle of betrayal. I'd given her a second chance, hoping we could build a life together, but she had thrown it all away. I couldn't live like this, constantly doubting, constantly waiting for the next shoe to drop. That night, I packed my bags and moved out. It wasn't easy, and the weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I struggled with the pain, the regret, the anger. But slowly, I started to rebuild, finding solace in new routines, new friendships, and, eventually, a new sense of peace. Lisa and I never fully reconciled. She reached out a few times, hoping to make amends, but I knew that going back would only lead to more heartache. Over time, I realized that sometimes, no matter how strong the love once was, it simply isn't enough to overcome betrayal. I've found a different kind of happiness now, a life where I can trust myself again, and that's something I'll never take for granted. This is the end of today's story. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more captivating stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.